Imagine a blank canvas. You draw a simple line, and then you imagine a little stick figure run across it. For some, this may be a roundabout way of getting the creative juices flowing. One little Flash game takes that microcosmic concept and runs, no barrels, down a deep slope to redefine creativity through gaming. The simplicity of Line Rider is deceptive. Like the blank canvas analog I constructed, it's up to the player to create something that reflects them while being a showcase for the game. I think it would be an understatement to say that Line Rider has inspired imagination and creation in all of us. Line Rider was conceived by Boštjan Kadez while attending Academy of Fine Arts in Slovenia. The first iteration of the game was launched in September of 2006 on Boštjan's DeviantArt account, where it garnered 10,000 viewers within 24 hours, affording YouTube videos about the game 15 million views before the end of 2006, which is insane for early YouTube. To say that this game spread like wildfire would be a massive understatement. Even though it was just a beta, the game became a phenomenon very quickly. Boštjan states that when he launched the game, his fellow students and even teachers couldn't stop playing the game. It just was word of mouth, Kadez says. That's what I hear. People told me, I showed it to someone at school and now everyone is playing it, even the teachers. Boštjan wasn't much of a gamer and noted he wanted to create a game that you wouldn't just follow, but release your creativity into. This novel concept allowed the game to skyrocket into popularity over the span of only a few weeks, which resulted in people taking the game and proliferating it elsewhere, either with just straight-up copies or hacks of the game. And with that proliferation, Line Rider caught the attention of In Exile Entertainment founder Brian Fargo, and they scooped up the rights to the game almost immediately. They wanted to expand on the original web version with its own dedicated website and 2 console sequels down the line, which we'll get to later. Over the past 15 years, the game has seen several updates. It's gone from an extremely simplistic menu with little options to being able to save files for tracks and videos itself, which is a far cry from where Line Rider started. In the first beta version, you could only use one line. In fact, the third beta for the game introduced deceleration lines, which have been removed from the current official release. Line Rider is often associated with Flash, but in 2008, the game was ported over to Microsoft's Silverlight, which was Microsoft's response to Adobe Flash. If I'm to speculate on the move to Silverlight, In Exile may have had to deal with Microsoft. With this move, they optimized the game for browsers while adding a feature to send Line Rider tracks through Windows Live Messenger. God, I missed that. Now that we got that out of the way, let's take a look at the game itself. How do you examine Line Rider as a game? At face value, Line Rider can be defined as a game, but in reality, it feels more like a creative physics sandbox that you just mess around in. There are no reward states for doing anything, not including other releases and iterations of Line Rider. In fact, Kadez doesn't even want to liken Line Rider to a game to begin with, going as far as to call it a toy, describing that you shouldn't be limited by mechanics. Well, I think it's interesting to ask whether Line Rider is a game or not. We're going to operate under the assumption that it is a game. In 2021, there are tons of open-ended sandbox games like this, and we all consider them games. It might just be the stigma around the word game when referring to the genre. Some people would want you to call it a digital experience, but I think we should be able to use the word game more liberally now. Line Rider is one of those sandbox experiences that lives and dies by how you interface with it. Whether that is just goofing off with incoherent lines that resemble slopes or creating an entire piece that accompanies an experimental rock album. Line Rider is a game that's like a Swiss Army knife. Every single little attachment works for something, but it's okay if you only use it for one thing and one thing only. But for those who want to master their craft, the tools are the fulcrum of what makes Line Rider such a simplistic but deep experience. Line Rider uses 3 types of lines: normal lines that create a path for Bosch to ride on, red lines that accelerate the sled when contact is made with them, and a green line that is purely made for cosmetics. meaning that it will not influence where Bosch in a sled will go. The last line is arguably one of the most important. It allows Line Rider to be more than just a showcase for physics and web games, but a fully fledged free art program focusing on the beauty of kinetic expression. How you get Bosch from one part of the screen to another is an art form. You can crudely draw red lines to get Bosch to blistering speeds, only to be met with a wall abruptly that dismounts Bosch, sending his corpse careening down a backward slope into an endless white void. You can attain a rhythmic flow by creating gentle hills, giving Bosch elegant airtime, meeting the next slope with gentle ease. But when you're able to add beautiful pictures accompanying it, it also becomes an unlikely storytelling tool. The physics of Line Rider is what sells the experience, but the potential of what you can do in the game is what holds it all together. Creating a map that syncs up to Mozart or a recreation of 1-1 from Super Mario Bros. Are just some cursory examples of the creative potential this game has. Like a blank canvas, Line Rider's potential is only definable by how far the community is willing to push what is possible in the game, even if the first iterations of the game didn't have an eraser tool. That's right, Line Rider initially didn't have an eraser tool, adding an entirely new dimension with how you go about creating tracks. This limitation presented a unique challenge to players looking to push the limits of what was possible in the early days. You had to be meticulous and deliberate with every stroke. Instead of the secret art program that we see today, it was sort of a puzzle game. Cadez has this to say on the matter. The idea is to draw lines and make a story out of it. The eraser is missing on purpose. It was part of the concept. I wanted it to be, in a way, like life. If you make a mistake, it's there. You can't just erase it. While an eraser was obviously added later, whether it was the original creator or a hacked version, this didn't stop the community of players that would go on to create hours upon hours of varying content. Line Rider was such a phenomenon that there were hacked versions with features that would come to be in the original version, not to mention recent efforts such as an open source port of the game, which I'll cover later in the video. Either way, the community is a large part of why this game has persisted 15 years after its release. It's something that's a little hard to believe, but let's examine the massive well of content that's been created by the Line Rider community, from the past and the present. Like Mario Paint, Line Rider was made for YouTube, which is to say, highly compressed, low-resolution screen recordings showcasing people's creativity. Line Rider was immediately a content-generating giant. The beta had only been out for a short time, and millions were already watching content about the game. Even in its infancy, we witnessed a glimpse of the creative potential Line Rider had. In 2006, YouTube had a strict cap on video length, only allowing normal users up to 10 minutes. For the first few years, there were only small clips of what people were doing in Line Rider. The most common example of a Line Rider video from this time were tracks that synced with songs. This concept would later be expanded with whole albums, arguably making some Line Rider tracks feature films. The most prominent example of this is This Will Destroy You, a feature-length visual adaptation of the self-titled album uploaded in July of 2017. With almost 3 million views, it's the most well-known, ambitious Line Rider track. While Line Rider was already known for syncing music with its track layout, what makes this film special is the visual simplicity of Line Rider being in synchronicity with the atmospheric post-rock. The 272 hours that were spent making this had to be riddled with a ton of contemplation, not only with how to sync the music with the track, but deliver the visual storytelling in a meaningful way. The album's dreamy and sub-ambient tone afford Line Rider's aesthetic. When watching this, it's easy to imagine riding down a snowy slope, the cold snowflakes hurtling down your face, obscuring your view to only a couple feet in front of you. This Line Rider track encapsulates a minimalist third-person view of that feeling. It's contemplative and deliberate, which is the philosophy with making Line Rider tracks to begin with. Like the album, every movement is carefully considered. Our ability to discern this Line Rider track as a film affords it the distinction as art, and the Line Rider community would lead you to believe that as well. One of the pillars of the Line Rider community is Line Rider Review, a YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing the best of Line Rider, culminating in best-of-year videos that are shockingly analytical and verbose. This community even has its own set of terminology with confusing names that require a video explaining it.
A manual is when you balance Bosch on the front of the sled or on the back of the sled. This one's called a nose manual and this one's called a tail manual.
A blue manual? How can it be blue? That's not blue.
There are red and blue lines. The red lines are acceleration lines. People like to use them to balance manuals. If you don't use the red lines, it's called a blue manual, which is harder.
Work.
A line rider playstyle with an emphasis on movement, tricks, and difficulty involving the exploitation of glitches in the line rider physics engine.
Why?
That's a very good question.
The way Line Rider Review goes over the tracks in their videos is fascinating. You can replace some of the language that's used with somebody that's talking about film, as if it's an art form that's been around for nearly a century.
TechDog's groundbreaking final work, Transcendental, was a spectacle of lavish scenery that would, unfortunately, kick off something of a line count arms race, leading to a trend of line rider artists burning out after attempting impossibly ambitious scenery projects. Using files from the Line Rider Archival Project, OTDE, a line rider artist known for their experimental and satirical works, has reinterpreted the scenery of Transcendental for a new purpose. As the name suggests, the road less traveled has Bosch taking an alternative path through the landscapes of Transcendental, exploring nooks and crannies glossed over in the original.
Oddly enough, Line Rider has a similar progression to Super Smash Bros. Melee. From a glance, they're both simple games that can be played in bite sizes, only scratching the surface of how broken and unintentionally complex you can take it. The difference between this and this are night and day. Community pillars like Line Rider Review demonstrate the longevity and passion that can be spawned from something as simple as a Flash game. That isn't to discount the track creators in the community either. The inane amount of content produced for Line Rider illustrates just how deep and layered a community can form over something seen as a novelty. The amount of Line Rider fan sites is evidence to this. The discourse around the game is so enthusiastic that it's palpable. It just helps that Line Rider Review is exposing it to a wider audience.
Number 2. Seen and Never Heard by Lucking. A somewhat absurd follow-up to Lucking's almost ridiculously bombastic 2015 release Assault, this absolutely stellar work pairs slow-paced quirk with hip-hop music in a marriage so good, it can only be described as a match made in heaven. Quick quirk stops and pops accentuate the drums, manual curves highlight sung phrases, and as the song draws focus from one to the other, the track moves seamlessly to follow that focus. The track matches the music so well, it feels closer than ever before to actually achieving the elusive subtitle of Raphael's jam, Music Visualized. There's a long way to go before we can truly say we have arrived at that point, but Seen and Never Heard is a huge step in that direction. Lucking is no longer concerned with...
Line Rider has earned its legacy, not only in the amount of content it's produced, but how the fans who played for years are taking up the helm with developing the game more, inside and outside of it. Line Rider Advanced is an open-source spiritual successor which aims to make the game available without the need of a web browser, while adding awesome features such as loading music into the game, and an in-depth tracked editing features that make some of the more advanced stuff easier to use. If you're looking to get back into the game and want to mess around with some of the more advanced features, I would check out Line Rider Advanced. But what about those official sequels? What did they do to progress the Line Rider lineage? After inXile bought the rights to Line Rider, the potential to turn it into a game for consoles and handhelds were conceptualized for the Wii and Nintendo DS. Line Rider 2 Unbound was released in fall of 2007, a year after Cadez's release of Line Rider. Line Rider 2 does not take the creative expression approach as seriously as its Flash counterpart, but does facilitate it in other ways. To make a fully fledged game for consoles, it couldn't just be an open sandbox game that was sold at full price. The solution? Simply create a puzzle game as the main mode, with the freestyle mode on the side. Unbound sees you completing courses by drawing lines to the goal, with coins to collect as a bonus. It also rewards you for doing it in creative ways. If you had to gamify Line Rider, this is how you would do it. inXile understood what made Line Rider so appealing, and I think this iteration of the title is the best possible outcome for a commercial release of Line Rider. This holds especially true with the commitment to the art style of the Flash game. Fargo understood what made the game successful way before it truly took off. The only issue is that you really can't replicate what makes the Flash game superior. Even with the free modes, you can't come close to getting the same expression as the Flash version. Even then, it's easier to capture your creations in a browser with a free screen recorder. If you wanted to extract these creations outside of their own file sharing features, you would either have to have a capture card or a camera capable enough of recording a DS screen effectively. The latter example would just take away the aesthetic value of what makes Line Rider videos appealing to begin with. This may be an unfair assessment of the game though, as it does add other notable features that make this purchase worthwhile, such as a multiplayer puzzle mode, different vehicles, and backgrounds for custom tracks. However, the gamified elements of the game took away what made Line Rider good. For some of the features, you had to play through the story mode to unlock them. The simplicity of the Flash game, in addition to being free, was practically unbeatable. Line Rider could run on a typewriter, and people weren't expecting to pay to play a puzzle game to get their Line Rider fix. Even though it didn't undermine Line Rider's fame, the game seemingly flopped in sales and critical reception. I didn't play with the original controls, but that was a source of contention for these titles. Nothing beats a mouse or a drawing tablet for Line Rider, and having to use a Wiimote was probably a nightmare, which turned people off to Line Rider in general. Which is a shame because I think it has an interesting legacy we need to examine. The upward surge of open-ended sandbox games may have been an unintentional response to all the violent, graphically intense video games coming out at the time. Sandbox games like Line Rider and Minecraft triumphantly state, "Look at what you can do in our game, not what the developers can show you in their game." Games have always pushed the boundaries of what technology is capable of, but Line Rider was on the cutting edge of interactability in a simple space. Line Rider wasn't about saving the galaxy from a giant multi-species alien cult or stopping the Russians from winning the war in 1080p HD. It was about facilitating your creativity in many ways you may have never thought about. It may be strange to consider this, but some future and present artists, animators, physicists, and even filmmakers were born in part due to playing Line Rider. I brought up Minecraft in tandem with Line Rider for a reason, because Minecraft's influence is way wider in this regard. Minecraft has had to have inspired many kids and maybe adults to pursue a myriad of interests and potential career paths as well. I've always predicted that Minecraft would birth a new wave of engineers and scientists. I think that will remain to be seen, but at least with Line Rider, artists were born the minute they started creating content out of the game. Gaming is often seen as an escape, planes of existence and interaction to offset the burden of real life. Call me idealistic, but I think gaming is an invaluable tool for learning. Line Rider's open-ended game design and propensity for artistic expression contributed to a progressive type of play, one of boundless creation with the only limits being your imagination. The title of this video may be a misnomer in some ways. The gaming community are still active, but I feel like we should be reminded of the game's simple approach to design and the depth of community it's brought to. With the oversaturation of gaming content, especially with how much easier it's becoming to create games now, we should look back at the notable examples of Flash games. Good mobile games must thank games like this for inspiring smaller scale design that inspires creativity over fleeting moments of a dopamine rush. However grim the gaming space might look now, innovation always pokes through the cracks. In Line Rider's case, it utilized its simplicity and ease of access to teach us that gaming can be a creative tool.